Hi, I'm Dr. Robert Barney. Welcome to part 2 of this session designed to provide you with an overview of social work research. During part 1 of this session, I provided an overview which included an introduction to research, an overview of the logic of social research, a discussion of research questions, an overview of single system design research, an overview of research ethics, research measurement, which included a discussion of validity and reliability, and a discussion of data collection. If you haven't had a chance to watch part 1 of the session, make sure to use the link in the description below to link you through to that video. During this particular session, we're going to be talking about qualitative research. We're going to talk about research designs. We'll talk about survey research, an introduction to statistics, and we'll discuss program evaluation. So let's go ahead and jump into our next section designed to provide you with an overview of qualitative research. As I had mentioned during part 1 of this session, there are a number of key differences between qualitative and quantitative research. I'm not going to spend much time comparing between these two fields, but I do want to take a moment just to review a couple of the key features that make qualitative research unique. First off, qualitative research is typically considered to be a much more subjective style of research. It uses an inductive approach to generating knowledge. It uses a smaller number of cases. Overall, it has a smaller sample size typically than quantitative research will. It focuses in on generating description, and it uses words instead of numbers to do this. And oftentimes, qualitative researchers are much more intimately involved in the process of conducting the research than quantitative researchers are, who will often use numbers and sometimes don't even have to be on site to conduct the research. One of the key features of qualitative research is that it doesn't use a single methodology by which it carries out the research. Instead, it uses a variety of different methodologies or approaches for qualitative research. Even within individual approaches, there's going to be variation in terms of how the researchers carry this out. Now, grounded theory is the first approach that we're going to be talking about. It's probably one of the best known approaches of qualitative research. When people hear the term grounded theory, they often think it must be a theory, but that's not what this is. Grounded theory is a qualitative approach designed to help researchers generate theories. The theories that they generate are inductive in nature, and what that means is that it's grounded or based in the words of the respondents themselves. Researchers want to make sure to bracket out as much pre-existing ideas and notions that they have about a particular field of study and make sure that the theory that they have generated is really based or again grounded in the words of those respondents themselves. Some grounded theory researchers don't even use a literature review at the beginning of their research in an effort to ensure that the theory they're generated really is based in the perspective of the research participants. Now, the major contributors to this particular approach include individuals such as Glasser and Strauss, as well as Strauss and Corbin. They're two different approaches within grounded theory. They started off together, but they went in slightly separate ways. But one of the key ways in which you will be able to tell if a qualitative study is grounded theory in its methodology or approach is by looking to see if these are some of the authors that are cited in the methodology section of that research paper. Now, another thing that makes grounded theory unique is that it uses comparative analysis, sometimes referred to as the constant comparative. Now, what does that mean? With the constant comparative, data collection and data analysis are happening at the same time. Think about typical research studies. Oftentimes, a researcher will go out, distribute a survey, they'll do their data collection, and after that's happened, data analysis will then proceed. But with grounded theory, it looks a little different. Data collection will begin. Perhaps an interview is conducted with one person, And then an interview will happen with a second person. But while the interview is happening with that second person, the researcher will begin analyzing the data and making comparisons between research subjects. And then when the third research subject comes along, then further analysis is taking place while the data collection is proceeding. So this is where you see this constant comparative or this comparative analysis where the data collection and the data analysis are happening simultaneously. The second major approach to qualitative research, or a second major qualitative methodology, is known as ethnography. Ethnography is used to describe social and cultural groups. As part of this style of research, it is the researcher's responsibility to investigate the value systems, the traditions, the patterns of behavior of different cultural groups. This particular qualitative research approach emerged out of the field of anthropology. It literally means to write about people or cultures. It draws upon other qualitative methods, so you'll find that it uses similar methods to grounded theory, such as the use of interviews, group discussion, observation, and so on, but it has its own unique approach given that it explicitly focuses on exploring cultures. Participatory action research is the third style of qualitative research, or the third approach that we're going to be talking about. This particular methodology focuses in on involving community members in the research itself. Participants become partners with the researcher. They're involved in identifying a particular community problem that they want to address. They work to develop the research methodology, carry out data collection, and they're involved in analyzing the findings. Once this research has been conducted, the participants don't stop there. It's not a matter of simply developing publications. Instead, the data is used to make recommendations about how problems can be solved. Participants become involved in advocating for change. Some of this involves applying for funding, legislation, community action, and so on. And really the end result of participatory action research is to help alleviate oppression or make community improvements. Now again, this is a third approach to qualitative research. There are many others that are out there, but for the purposes of our video, we're not going to go into more depth exploring those other methodologies. These three at this point are all we're going to be covering. Within quantitative research, researchers have a number of different strategies that they use to ensure the rigor or the strength of their studies. Quantitative researchers will often use probability sampling to ensure that results from a sample can be generalized to the target population. They'll also use validity and reliability to ensure the accuracy and consistency of their measurement instruments. But with qualitative research, the rigor or the strength of a study is ensured in a different way. Rigor is all about ensuring that the study's findings are authentic. Now, rigor is achieved in qualitative research through establishing the trustworthiness of the research. A trustworthy study is one that's carried out fairly and ethically, and whose findings represent as closely as possible the experiences of respondents. Now, there are a number of different threats to trustworthiness in a qualitative research study. This includes reactivity. Reactivity is when the researcher themselves and their presence may interfere with behaviors, attitudes, and feelings of those that they're trying to understand. Okay, so people may be reacting to them. We also find that the researcher may be biased. Okay, the researcher's bias could be coming through in the form of the types of informants that they are choosing to participate in the study. They may be asking biased or leading questions, or maybe they're ignoring data that doesn't support their perspective or the direction that they're going in. So a threat to trustworthiness would be researcher bias, and you can also have the bias of the respondents as well, or of the research participants. And this occurs when individual participants may withhold information, or maybe perhaps tell the researcher what they want to hear. Qualitative researchers use a number of different strategies in order to help enhance the rigor or the strength of their studies. One of the ways in which they do this is through prolonged engagement. The whole idea behind this is that if a person spends more time within a research context, it's going to help to reduce things such as reactivity. People will become more comfortable with the researcher, and it will help to eliminate things such as both the bias of the researcher as well as the bias of the respondents themselves. Researchers will often use triangulation as another strategy to enhance rigor within their studies. And this is when you use two or more sources to get a more comprehensive picture of the issue or the topic that you're studying. For example, if I'm trying to investigate the experiences of individuals living with HIV/AIDS, I may want to talk to the individuals who are experiencing HIV/AIDS, as well as get the perspectives of others who bring a different viewpoint, such as their caregivers or their family members or community members. Again, these multiple sources of data and these multiple perspectives will help to enhance the rigor of the overall study. Researchers can also use peer debriefing. This is when a researcher takes some of their ideas and their conclusions back to their research peers to get their impressions and interpretations of the data that's been collected and some of the conclusions that have resulted from the data analysis. And a researcher can also use member checking. So instead of taking research results back to their peers or other researchers, a researcher can take research results or some of the results from data analysis to the individuals who had participated in the research themselves to get their impressions, to ensure that they are coming to the right conclusions about what was stated and what was shared and some of the similarities across research respondents. Qualitative researchers can also use negative case analysis in order to enhance the rigor or the strength of their study. Oftentimes in research, outliers or different perspectives are often left out of research findings and conclusions, but with qualitative research, it can become possible to use those negative cases or those alternative perspectives in order to bring about a more nuanced and fuller interpretation of the data itself. So using those negative cases or those outliers instead of disregarding them because they don't fit with the tendencies of the overall group. Researchers can also use an audit trail in order to enhance the rigor of their study. And what this means is that the researcher documents each step that's taken during the research process so that other readers of the research can confirm the findings that have been reported by the researcher. Adherence to theory and methodology is another way to enhance the strength of the qualitative research study. What this means is that if a researcher identifies a particular theoretical approach or methodology, such as grounded theory, then it becomes the responsibility of the researcher to remain faithful to that theoretical perspective or the methodology and provide explanation for when deviation takes place. So if I say that I'm going to use grounded theory, I should make sure to adhere to that particular methodology instead of using things like participatory action research. So adherence is a way to enhance rigor of a study. And finally, a researcher can disclose personal bias. This helps to eliminate some of the researcher bias, although really, can bias ever be completely eliminated from a research study? We're not talking here about overt forms of bias and racism and sexism and those kind of things. What we're talking about is the bias in terms of the perspective that the researcher brings to the research study. So instead of eliminating those perspectives, some qualitative researchers will emphasize that you have to disclose your own perspective, given that we all come from our own background, we all have our own way of seeing the world and interpreting that. So if you disclose that to the researchers, it helps to inform the researchers, and it becomes almost a way of documenting some of the limitations that the researcher will bring as they attempt to interpret the results of a research study. During this next section, we're going to be talking about research designs. Research designs are really a blueprint for the research study that describe how data will be collected, especially in relation to interventions and treatments that are being used in the research study. This blueprint are the details of how the researcher will attempt to answer the research question. Now, let's say, for instance, we had a researcher who's going to implement cognitive behavioral therapy. Their hypothesis is that CBT will help to decrease clients' levels of anxiety. A researcher could conduct this study where they just administer treatment and then conduct their survey-based research. However, it wouldn't be a very strong research study. How are we to know if the levels of anxiety were high or low before treatment actually started? So what researchers can actually do is use a research design known as the one-group pre-test, post-test design to evaluate the effectiveness of their research. So instead of just assessing anxiety levels after treatment, they can begin with a pre-test assessment of anxiety, followed by the treatment. In this case, it could be CBT. And then after CBT has been administered for a period of time, an additional assessment of anxiety could take place. Now, pre-tests, interventions, and post-tests are typically represented using O's and X's, such as what you see here on the PowerPoint. What this allows a researcher to do is make comparisons pre versus post cognitive behavioral therapy to see the level of impact that treatment had on the outcome variable. Now, the one group pre-test, post-test design isn't the only way to design a research study. It helps us to determine pre and post-test what anxiety was, so a comparison can be made, but it can also be effective to make comparisons between groups, such as between groups who received treatment and those who did not. And for this, we turn to the static group comparison design. In a design like this, a social worker may have their own clients that they are administering treatment to. But then what they can do is actually partner perhaps with another practitioner or another agency who's delivering services perhaps, but maybe not cognitive behavioral therapy to address anxiety. What that researcher can do is administer cognitive behavioral therapy. Let's say that they administer it for 3 months. And then after that period of treatment, they can administer an anxiety scale to assess their clients' levels of anxiety after treatment. Now, what they can do is identify this other practitioner at their agency who's not using that same treatment and give the same outcome evaluation of anxiety to their clients. So essentially what we'd be doing is making comparisons between a cognitive behavioral therapy group and another group who did not receive that same cognitive behavioral therapy to evaluate outcomes in relation to anxiety. Another option available to researchers is known as a time series design. Now, when we looked at the one group pre-test, post-test design, we were making comparisons before and after an intervention took place. But how are we to know if levels of anxiety weren't naturally going down over time before the research process started? So we have immediately before and immediately after, but maybe it was already heading in that downward slope direction already. The time series design helps us to determine if that was taking place. So what can happen in a case like this is perhaps a social worker has an electronic version of an anxiety inventory that they administer a number of weeks before they actually conduct the cognitive behavioral therapy. So let's say they have one administration of this survey 3 weeks before, 2 weeks before, 1 week before, followed by the intervention. And then after the intervention or cognitive behavioral therapy, there could be an immediate post-test survey that's conducted, a post-test survey perhaps a week after, and then 2 weeks after. This helps us to determine if any trends were happening before treatment began or perhaps even after treatment began. So was there any sort of trend towards lower levels of anxiety, or perhaps increasing levels of anxiety had been interrupted by treatment. And then post-test, we can help to determine if the changes that are being experienced by a client continue to improve, or if they stabilize over time, or what exactly has gone on. So again, this really helps us to determine if any sort of trends or patterns of behavior are occurring in relation to treatment. Now, one way to make a time series design even stronger or improved is to add a comparison group to the time series design. We call this the multiple time series design. And again, you have a number of pre-test assessments of anxiety. One group would receive an intervention, cognitive behavioral therapy. The comparison group would not. And then you have a number of post-tests following these changes in anxiety over time. Now, each of the design types that we've been talking about to this point are good, but they're not ideal. Most of these designs have fallen under the categories of pre-experimental designs and quasi-experimental designs, but they're not as strong as true experimental designs. Now, experimental designs are unique in that they utilize control groups, and the samples that are included in these studies are randomly assigned to either the experimental or the control group. Now, the most common type of experimental design is known as the classic experimental design. What you're going to notice on this diagram here is that it looks very similar to some of the other designs we've already been talking about in its use of O's to represent pre-tests and post-tests, X's to represent interventions, but there's a new feature here, an R, and the R represents random assignment. That's the random assignment to either the experimental or the control group. So let's say that we have a researcher who is conducting research on a cultural sensitivity training, and they want to see the impact that this training has on training participants. So let's say that we have a researcher who is attending an annual meeting at the National Association of Social Workers. And at this meeting, they randomly assign participants to either the experimental group or the control group. The experimental group will be given special training sessions on cultural sensitivity. Everyone will be given a pre-test assessment about perhaps cultural appreciation, which assesses views and opinions of other cultures. But again, only the experimental group would receive the cultural sensitivity training while the other would not. Following the cultural sensitivity training, both groups would again be given surveys to assess their views and opinions of other cultures. At the end, what the researchers would be able to do is not only make comparisons between before and after the intervention took place, but they would also be able to make comparisons between the experimental and control group to see if there were any major differences in relation to those groups. Now, in some cases, it's not a good idea to use a pretest. And the reason for that is because people can actually learn and change as a result of a pretest. Let's take, for example, this research training. If I wanted to give you some testing to assess your level of knowledge about research, I could give you a test before this training to assess your level of knowledge about research, followed by this training, and then a post-test to assess your level of knowledge after the intervention. Was it really my training that resulted in higher levels of knowledge on the post-test? Or is it possible that perhaps you could have learned from the pre-test itself, just based upon questions about research? So for this reason, researchers will sometimes eliminate use of the pretest to avoid this conflict. Now, the same thing could be true in relation to our example where we talked about the NASW cultural sensitivity training. People may adjust their responses on a post-test just based upon what they had gotten from the pre-test earlier. Okay, so in a case like this, researchers could drop the pretest and just randomly assign conference participants to an experimental or a control group. And again, only one group could get the cultural sensitivity training, but both groups would receive a post-test survey to assess their opinions and views of different cultures. This can be, once again, really useful when the pretest itself could be influencing some of the responses on an outcome or a post-test survey. Now, one of the downsides of these two experimental designs that we've talked about are that both of them have some inherent weaknesses. With the classic experimental design, we have this possibility that people could be learning from the pretest, and that may be influencing results on the post-test. But then in the post-test only control group design, one of the problems is we don't have the pretest, so we can't make comparisons between before and after an intervention takes place. The Solomon four-group design is used to help overcome some of these deficits and challenges. And the ways in which it does that is by pairing the classic experimental design with the post-test only control group design. So if you look at the first two lines, that's the classic experimental design. And then the third and fourth line is the post-test only control group design. So instead of randomly assigning people to two groups, the research participants could be assigned to four groups, and those procedures would run in parallel with one another. Only groups 1 and 2 receive a pretest. Groups 1 and 3 would both receive the intervention, while 2 and 4 do not receive an intervention, but everybody who participates in the study would participate in the post-test. Again, this is known as the Solomon four-group design. Now, as we talk about experimental designs and their use of random assignment, it's easy to get confused about the differences between this random assignment and what we talked about in relation to sampling, which is random selection. So let me take just a moment to highlight the differences between these two types of randomization. Random selection occurs during sampling. Random selection occurs when a sample is drawn from a target population in such a way that all cases have equal chance of being selected. This is done to help us to ensure generalizability of findings, that we can actually apply this finding from a sample to the broader target population. This type of sampling is used in sampling design types such as simple random sampling, stratified sampling, and systematic sampling. Random assignment, on the other hand, occurs during research design. Random assignment occurs when all members of a sample have equal chances of being assigned to the experimental or the control condition. And as we have talked about in the last couple of slides, this applies to classic experimental designs, the post-test only control group design, and in Solomon four-group designs. Now, as we talk about research designs, it's also important to consider the concept known as internal validity. Internal validity is the extent to which a study is able to sort out whether it was truly the intervention that caused changes in the dependent variable. Think about it in another way. It's the confidence we have that the results of the study accurately depict whether the independent variable influences the dependent variable. Now, in our efforts to determine if it was the independent variable that created some of the change in the dependent variable, there are some things, some threats that we can work to eliminate. Things that would cause us to question if it was the IV that impacted the DV. Okay. One of these threats to internal validity we've already talked about. It's known as testing. This is when the process of testing itself can improve performance on post-tests. This is a very common threat when we use pre- and post-test design research, such as what was found in the classic experimental design research study. A second major type of threat to internal validity is known as maturation. Maturation is the passage of time which can cause people to grow and change. Okay, sometimes People are going to learn naturally over time. They're going to grow in their knowledge and in their intellect. And the way in which we assess if this is a factor that influences dependent variables is with longitudinal designs, such as the time series design, which we had talked about earlier. Now, another threat to internal validity that would cause us to question if it was the independent variable that impacted the dependent variable is history. History refers to when other events may occur during the time of the study that might confuse the results or create a change in scores in the dependent variable. Okay, let's take, for instance, if we were going to be conducting this research study about the impact of cognitive behavioral therapy on a person's level of anxiety. If this research study was going on at the same time that we were in lockdown during COVID-19, we would question, was it really cognitive behavioral therapy that produced some of the changes that we saw, or was there an influence of COVID-19 that was going on during that research study? Now, we can help to address some of this through the use of control group designs. That helps us to determine if it was a change experienced just by the experimental group or if there was a similar pattern going on in relation to a control group. Again, it's the comparison between these two groups that can help to minimize this threat known as history. Another common threat to internal validity is known as statistical regression. Statistically speaking, subsequent testing will often cause extreme scores to regress to the mean. This particular type of threat to internal validity is something that just naturally occurs with numbers. And the way in which we can help to control for some of this is through a randomly assigned control group. Okay. Another big threat to internal validity is instrumentation changes. Now, earlier on, we talked about how people can learn by taking tests. Instrumentation refers to when researchers will sometimes change things up. Perhaps if I'm trying to keep you from learning about specific answers to questions on a test, I could give you the first version, the pre-test version of a test, and make the post-test version slightly different. Well, then we start to question, were the differences in pre and post-test scores a result of the intervention, or was it the result of these instrumentation changes? It recognizes that different measures on subsequent tests can produce different results. Okay, another big type of threat to internal validity is experimental attrition. This is when people drop out of a study. In some extreme cases, during the course of a research study, people may pass away. Okay, they may pass away naturally, especially if you're doing research among older adults. But in most cases with research, it just refers to the fact that people will sometimes drop out of research studies. But when research subjects are lost, that can impact the results of a study. Let's refer back to this example of cognitive behavioral therapy and anxiety. What would happen if a person's level of anxiety went so high that they dropped out because they really couldn't handle participating in the research study? Okay, we don't know if that's part of the reason, but the fact that they dropped out really kept us from being able to include their numbers in the research study. Okay, so again, mortality and experimental attrition can be a risk that causes us to question if it was really the intervention that impacted a dependent variable or if there was something else like this attrition that had created some of this change. Now, the final type of threat to internal validity we're going to talk about is selection bias. And this refers to the fact that groups being compared really do need to be comparable. If there was selection bias as part of the research, how do we not know that the experimental group was loaded in such a way that biased the results in comparison to a different group? Now, the way in which we control for some of this is by using random assignment. When we assign people to either the experimental or the control group, this helps to eliminate some of that bias inherent in assigning people to these two groups. Now, we've talked about internal validity and threats to internal validity. Again, internal validity has to do with this idea that it was truly the independent variable or the intervention that created some of the change that we see in the dependent variable. External validity is something different. External validity has to do with whether an experiment can be applied or generalized to the real world. It refers to whether inferences made in an experiment can be generalized to other times, settings, or groups of people. In the same way that there were threats to internal validity, there are also threats to external validity, but just in the interest of time, we're going to skip over some of these threats as part of today's session. In this next section, we're going to be talking about survey research. Now, when you consider survey instruments, it's possible to develop a completely new survey, or you can work with an existing or an old instrument. When you use a new survey, one of the things that it requires for you to do is develop the questions from scratch. But you can't just come up with a question off the top of your head and then administer it to research participants. Instead, these questions require extensive pilot testing to make sure that they are understood by research participants, that they truly do assess what it is that you're trying to assess. So this can be rather time consuming. But one of the benefits of that approach is that you can design questions that fit your variables and your research subjects specifically. With an older instrument or an existing research instrument, first off, you have to determine if there's an instrument out there that matches the variables you are trying to collect data about. One of the benefits of this approach are that these previously used questions have been established as being valid and reliable, or those are some of the qualities that you would be looking for in an older existing instrument. And basically what this means is that the questions are tested and true. They've been found to be accurate and consistent. There are a variety of different ways in which we can structure survey questions to assess the variables included in our research study. For example, you can use a single item to measure a single variable in your research study, but there's a variety of ways in which you can actually do that as well. For instance, you can ask an open-ended question in order to assess a single variable. An open-ended question is when you ask a question and allow people to fill in the blanks and provide their own answer. What this might look like would be the following. In your own words, please briefly describe your experience with research and your current attitudes towards it. It's not a single word that a person would use to respond to this. They may talk about their frustrations and their fears with research. They may talk about how it instills a sense of creativity and exploration for them. But it's completely up to the respondent to fill in the blank and to provide an answer in their own word. Again, this is an example of an open-ended question or open-ended item. Another way in which we can use a single item to assess a single variable is through a fixed alternative item. This is when you have a question with a variety of predetermined answer categories that an individual could choose from. In most cases, a person is going to choose just one response category. An example, and what this might look like, would be the following. Please indicate your current legal marital status by circling the letter of one response below. Are you married, single never married, separated, divorced, or widowed? Another way in which we can use one item to assess a single variable is through a simple index. A simple index would be a statement or a question followed by a variety of response categories that exist on a spectrum. For example, what this could look like would be, how would you rate your marriage overall, with response categories existing between 1 and 10, with 1 representing very good through 10, which would be very poor, and a variety of different responses that would match those numbers throughout as well. Now, in addition to using a single item to assess a single variable on a survey, you could also use two or more items to assess a single variable. These two or more items that are clustered together that measure the same variable are typically referred to as scales. So again, a scale is a cluster or a group of statements or questions that are designed to measure a single concept. Some of the advantages of scaling are that it helps to improve validity, it helps to improve reliability, it increases our level of measurement, and it increases efficiency in data handling. One example of a scale where two or more items are used to assess or measure a single variable is a Likert scale. A Likert scale is probably the most common type of scale that we use in social research. Now, a Likert scale consists of a series of statements or items, each followed by a series of response alternatives. These response alternatives commonly look like the following: strongly disagree, disagree, neutral, agree, and strongly agree. The numbers associated with each response can be totaled to provide an overall score. And it's for this reason that Likert scales are sometimes referred to as summative scales, because they can be summed, or the answer choices can be added together to give a total score. A Likert scale is often also referred to as a linear scale because the response categories all go in the same direction across the various items that are used. An example of a Likert scale can be seen on the following image. This includes a job satisfaction scale. As part of this job satisfaction scale, you'll see the response categories that I'd referred to earlier: strongly disagree through strongly agree. But each of the items included are a different way of assessing a person's job satisfaction. They include: overall, I'm satisfied with my job. I feel like I'm being listened to. I get along well with my colleagues. This organization has good career opportunities, and I know exactly what is expected of me. A person would answer the response choices using strongly disagree through strongly agree, and once those have all been answered, the researcher can add up the responses to give a total score for that person's level of job satisfaction. Another example of a scale where two or more items can be used to assess a single variable is the Gutman scale. In Gutman scaling, items have a progressive nature relating to the intensity of the variable being measured. Participants would be asked to check each statement with which they agree. Now, an example of a Gutman scale is the Borgadas social distance scale. So a person would go through each of these statements and just provide a check if they agree with that statement. These statements include: are you willing to permit immigrants to live in your country? And then the statement intensifies: are you willing to permit immigrants to live in your community? Are you willing to permit immigrants to live in your neighborhood? Are you willing to permit immigrants to live next door to you? Would you permit your child to marry an immigrant? So as you saw, each of these statements are made in rank order. A person answering positively to one rank order level will answer positively to lower rank order items. So we would say, if I'm willing to permit immigrants to live in my neighborhood, then it's safe to assume they would also live in my community or my country, or I'd be willing to allow that to happen. Okay. At some point, a person will probably reach a cutoff point. And if that cutoff point would be point number 3, then both 4 and 5 would be answered negatively. The way in which this type of scale is scored is based upon the number of check marks or agreements that a person indicates in relation to the items on the scale. Again, just a slightly different way of scaling your items in comparison to a traditional Likert scale. In this next section, I'm going to be providing you with some basic information relating to statistics relevant to social research. We're not going to be going into a lot of depth in relation to statistics. I just want you to understand a few key concepts. The first concept I want you to understand about statistics has to do with levels of measurement. Now, variables can exist at a couple of different levels of measurement. This includes nominal, ordinal, interval, or ratio. Nominal variables are variables with values that have mutually exclusive categories. Okay, so let's take, for instance, the variable gender. Gender is an attribute or a characteristic that can differ in terms of quantity or quality. So it has these different values. And the values that we have include man, woman, and transgender. Okay, at the nominal level of measurement, which is what this variable is, man, woman, and transgender are mutually exclusive categories, and they could be considered exhaustive. Okay, so that's the nominal level of measurement. Sometimes on nominal level of measurement variables, you can see numbers associated with these. So sometimes a researcher may assign 1 to man, 2 to woman, and 3 to transgender. But these are just used to identify categories. They're merely symbols, and the numbers really don't mean anything. So look at the values, what they mean, and that'll help you to determine that these are just mutually exclusive value categories. The next level of measurement are ordinal. Okay? Ordinal level of measurement variables are when we have variables with value categories that are mutually exclusive, so similar to nominal, but they go a step further. Now those values have an inherent fixed order in relation to them, so they are ranked in some way. An example of this might be a Likert scale where you're indicating your level of agreement. Okay, so our response categories, or the different values that are associated with this includes strongly disagree, disagree, neutral, agree, and strongly agree. So yes, our mutually exclusive category, but now those categories are in a fixed or a rank order. And that's what makes them ordinal level of measurement. The next level of measurement is the interval level of measurement. Measures that are at the interval level of measurement have mutually exclusive categories. Okay? They also have a ranked or a fixed order associated with the values. However, this one goes a step further than some of our other levels of measurement because now these categories have equal spacing between them. Okay? A great example of something like this would be temperature. With temperature, we see equal spacing between each of the degrees Fahrenheit on a thermometer. So you can have 30 degrees Fahrenheit, 80 degrees Fahrenheit. We know that there are categories associated with each of these, and because there's an actual numeric value associated with this, there's equal spacing between these categories. However, interval stops there. What distinguishes it from the next level is that it doesn't have a true 0 point. So even though you can have 0 degrees Fahrenheit, that 0 is not a true 0 point because you can have a negative value associated with it. Okay, so interval level measures have equal spacing between categories, but no true 0 point. Variables at the ratio level of measurement go a step beyond interval level of measurement variables. So for the interval level of measurement variables, they have mutually exclusive categories at an inherent fixed or rank order. There were equal spacing between those categories, but at the interval level, there's no true 0 point. Ratio goes a step beyond this, and now this level of measurement does have a true 0 point. So the values associated with this could be at the 0 level of measurement. An example of a variable at the ratio level of measurement would be annual income. If I asked you to answer what is your annual income, you could tell me $30,000 a year, $80,000 a year. You could also tell me $0 a year. So 0 is an actual response category, and it would be a true 0 point at that level, making it a variable at the ratio level of measurement. You could also discuss a person's prison sentence length. So a person could say that they have a prison sentence of 12 months. It could be 5 years. It could be a lifetime prison sentence. It could also be 0. So that prison sentence length could also be a variable with a true 0 point, making it a ratio level of measurement variable. One of the things that you're going to find as you get into statistical analyses is that you have to have a strong working knowledge of levels of measurement. We're going to keep coming back to levels of measurement as we delve into statistics in more depth. And if you go beyond this into even more knowledge and study of statistics, you'll find that levels of measurement are really key to understanding and functioning within this particular field. All right, next thing that we're going to discuss are the different types of statistics that social researchers will engage in. You can actually break these up into 3 different categories. There's univariate statistics, bivariate statistics, and multivariate statistics. Univariate statistics are statistics that describe the distribution of a single variable. So univariate, one variable. Bivariate statistics, on the other hand, are statistics that describe the relationship between 2 variables. So this is why we have bivariate. And then multivariate statistics are statistics that describe the relationship between 3 or more variables. So let's dive into univariate statistics in a bit more depth. Again, univariate statistics have to do with understanding the distribution of a single variable. One of the more common types of univariate statistics are measures of central tendency. There are actually 3 different measures of central tendency that researchers can choose from. These include the mode, the median, and the mean. Again, all of these are univariate statistics. The mode is the value that occurs most frequently in a distribution. So when you think about a variable, we have different values associated with it. And if we provide a variable or a statement relating to a variable in a survey, we would be paying attention to the value that pops up the most frequently. So the response that comes up the most. An example of this can be seen in numeric format here on the slide. And what you see, we have different responses that have been indicated. One individual answered 2. We have a couple of different individuals who'd answered 3, a couple who'd answered 4, 2 who answered 5, and then 1 who'd answered 6. The mode is the value that pops up the most frequently in our distribution. So in this case, we can see that the mode is 3. That's the value that is appearing more than any others in our respondents' answers. Now, researchers will choose to use the mode if they have a variable that is at the nominal level of measurement. Okay, so if you have a variable at the nominal level of measurement, if you want to report the measure of central tendency, use the mode. Report the value that pops up the most frequently. The next measure of central tendency is the median. The median is the number that divides an array of numbers into 2 equal halves. So if you have people providing these responses, 2s, 3s, 4s, and 5s, put those into a rank order. And what you're going to want to do is work from either end and see which number falls at the very middle of that spectrum of values. In this case, it's the 4, so the median is the 4. Researchers will use the median when they are working with variables at the ordinal level of measurement. Okay, so again, if your variables are at the ordinal level of measurement, report the mean as your measure of central tendency. The final measure of central tendency is the mean. This is what we typically refer to as the average. Okay, it is the sum of all values in a distribution divided by the total number of values, or the total number of people in your sample. Okay, so we have this same example, all these values on an array. And what you're going to want to do is you add them all together and divide by the total number of values, or the number of cases that you have. So in this case, you're adding your 2s, your 3s, and your 4s. You're going to come up with a number which is 42. Then you're going to divide this by 11. That's because that's the number of values that we have, or the number of cases. And our number that we come up with is a 3.81. So our mean or our average is 3.81. Researchers will typically use the mean as their measure of central tendency when they have variables at the interval or ratio level of measurement. Another important type of univariate analysis are graphs and charts. Graphs and charts aren't statistical analyses per se, but instead they're visual representations of the distribution across a single variable. Bar graphs are one type of graph, and this specific kind of graph is a useful way for displaying nominal and ordinal level of measurement data. So if you have a variable at the nominal or the ordinal level of measurement, you can use a bar graph. What you're going to find are that we have different bars in a bar graph. This represents the horizontal axis. The horizontal axis represents the different categories or values associated with a variable. The vertical axis, on the other hand, represents the frequency associated with each of those different value categories. One thing that you want to note about bar graphs are that there are spaces between each of the bars, helping to signify that we have discrete categories in the variable. Another common type of graph or chart is the pie chart. This one is similar to the bar graph in how it's useful for displaying data measured on nominal and ordinal level of measurement variables. But while the bar graph has different bars across the horizontal axis, with the vertical axis representing the frequency of each value, the pie chart exists in a 360-degree circle. So the relative size of each value is represented by a pie slice. This is an effective way of showing how values exist in proportion to other values on a variable. The final type of graph that we're going to be talking about is the histogram. The histogram is useful for displaying data relating to interval or ratio level variables. This one also looks very similar to the bar graph, but the bar graph had spaces between each of the different value categories. Because we're working with interval or ratio level data, the data is considered more continuous, so there's no space found between the bars. But in the same way as we found with bar graphs, the height of each category represents the frequencies indicated for each value category. So far in our discussion of statistics, we have looked at univariate statistics. These statistics help us to understand the distribution of a single variable. We can do this using measures of central tendency, or we can do this using graphs and charts. Bivariate tests, on the other hand, help us to understand the relationship between two variables. Now, in reviewing research and research studies, you're going to come across a number of different bivariate statistical tests. These include things such as the F-test, which is used in relation to ANOVAs. This includes t-tests, and this also includes Pearson R's. Now, we're not going to have enough time to go into depth about how each of these statistical tests work at this point. You'll need a more in-depth course for that. But I do want to make you aware that each of these types of statistical tests are used to test the strength of relationship between two variables. When bivariate statistics are calculated, they're often accompanied by another type of statistical test referred to as statistical significance. Statistical significance is when a result is not likely to have occurred due to chance. So it really represents when there is a true relationship between variables, not a chance occurrence. Statistical significance relates to probability, and probability is important when we want to generalize our findings. So when we're thinking about our bivariate statistics, we want to determine what will happen the next time I use an intervention. Will we see the same results the next time? And can we expect to see, for example, lower levels of anxiety among the target population after they participate in cognitive behavioral therapy? Can the same results that we saw with our sample be expected among the general population? The way in which statistical significance is calculated is through a p-value. Now, the p-value stands for probability. Typically, researchers don't state what an actual p-value is, but instead they want to ensure that a p-value falls below a certain point. If it falls below a certain point, then we would consider the result of that test to be statistically significant. Okay. Now, generally, the p-value is set to be at 0.05 or below. And what that means, if you think about the 0.05 as a percentage, what it means is that there's only a 5% chance or less that our results could have been due to chance or due to error. Now, in other words, if we kind of look at this from the flip side, it means that we're 95% certain or confident that the results represent a true relationship or a pattern and are not due to chance. Now, as I mentioned before, for a lot of social research, the p-value is set at 0.05 or below. But in other kinds of research, you're going to find that those p-values can sometimes be at the 0.01 level or below, or the 0.001 level and below. During our last section, we're going to be talking about program evaluation. Program evaluation can actually be carried out in a couple of different ways. We're going to be talking about needs assessment, formative evaluations, and outcome evaluations. A needs assessment is conducted to determine if a program that's being considered is really needed, or if existing programs meet that need. Needs assessments are conducted by organizations to understand unmet needs and challenges that communities are facing. So as a needs assessment is being conducted, researchers need to consider questions such as, is the problem that we think exists a real one? And what program is needed to address the problem? And even more so, can we provide that program? Now, while a needs assessment focuses in on investigating unmet needs within a community and the programs that could be utilized to address those needs, a formative evaluation, sometimes referred to as a process evaluation, looks at programs that are already operating. These evaluations are conducted to determine if the program is on schedule and doing what it intended to do. It's used to generate suggestions for overcoming obstacles to program implementation, and they're done to recommend ways to improve the program and the way in which it's carried out. While a needs assessment looks at unmet community needs, and formative evaluation investigate the ways in which a program is carried out, a summative evaluation is an outcome evaluation. An outcome evaluation is really one of the best known forms of evaluation research, and it's probably the one that most of us think of when we think about program evaluation. It focuses in on if the program achieves the objectives that it was supposed to. And it's not just useful for agencies or organizations that run the programs, but for those who are interested in implementing similar programs, and even for funders who are trying to evaluate if the money that they're using is being used to meet the objectives they set out to do. While needs assessments, formative evaluations, and outcome evaluations help us to identify the different things that can be evaluated in relation to a program, a logic model really helps to break those programs down even further into its necessary components, and it helps guide us in terms of identifying the things and the variables that could be investigated as part of these different forms of evaluation. Now, logic models include various components such as the situation of an organization and its programs, the organization's priorities, the inputs of an organization, the outputs, and the outcomes. So let's talk a little bit further about each one of these major categories. The situation of an organization really relates to the needs within the local community, the context in which the organization is operating. As they consider the needs of local populations, organizations have to consider symptoms versus problems, and they also have to consider stakeholder engagement. So the level of engagement of the local community in relation to the program and needed services. Now, in addition to the situation, you also have to consider the priorities of the organization itself, not just the context in which it's operating, but also the organization and what it aims to achieve. As we think through these priorities, we have to consider the mission of an organization, its vision and values, what mandates and resources they have to address community concerns, what some of the local dynamics are in relation to the organization, who the collaborators are in these efforts, and who possible competitors might be. You also have to consider, as they set out and identify the mission of an organization, it's really important to understand what the intended outcomes originally are for the program. Okay, so this is the context, the situation, and the priorities of an organization. Next, you also want to make sure to consider the inputs of an organization, and this is what we invest in our programs. The types of investment can include things such as the staff members, volunteers, the investment of time and money, the research base that helps to support these efforts, the materials needed to deliver services, equipment, technology, and partners. If you're delivering therapy, the materials could be some of the workbooks that are used as part of therapy, the equipment. It may or may not be relevant to an organization. Certainly, if you're doing home health care, then equipment needs are going to be a little bit more prioritized than equipment relating to therapy. Okay, but again, these are the inputs of an organization, and it's going to be unique given the purposes and the services that are delivered by an organization in its programs. Now, in addition to inputs, we also have outputs. Outputs are some of the activities that an organization conducts. These are the what we do's as an organization. An organization may be involved in conducting workshops and meetings. They may deliver services such as therapy. They may be in the business of developing products or curriculum and resources. So this curriculum could include educational curriculum. It could include some of the curriculum relating to therapy, so psychoeducation, and the list goes on from there. The services also include trainings, providing counseling, conducting assessment, facilitation, partnering, working with the media, and the list goes on from there. Now, as part of our outputs, in addition to activities, we also have participation, and this is where we have to consider who it is that we're reaching. So who is the client base? Who are the participants? And certainly if we're delivering services on a contract basis, who are the agencies that we are working with, that we're reaching? Who are the decision makers? Who are the customers? Okay, now in addition to inputs and outputs of an organization, there are also outcomes. Outcomes exist on a short-term, medium-term, and a long-term basis. The short-term outcomes include things such as learning, awareness, knowledge, attitudes, skills, opinions, aspirations, and motivations. Think about it this way. If I am sitting in a room with a client and I am conducting cognitive behavioral therapy, what can I expect short-term change to look like, or short-term results? Certainly I can teach them about cognitive behavioral therapy, some of the steps that are included, what would be required of them. And in doing that, I'm building their knowledge, I'm contributing to their learning and their awareness. I may even be able to shape some of their attitudes in relation to therapy. But things that are a little bit more medium term are going to be things such as behavioral change. You can't necessarily expect a person to change their behaviors immediately in the short term. And that's why oftentimes actions, behaviors, practices, decision making, even the policies of organizations and the actions of those organizations would be considered more medium term results. Now, the long-term results are going to be changes in the overall conditions, the social and economic conditions that people face, even the broader community, when you start considering the bigger impact of these programs on local communities. I also want to highlight that now that we've identified each of these major components of an organization using the logic model approach, it's possible to consider the interface or the overlap between this logic model and the types of program evaluation that we had been talking about earlier. As we look at our logic model once more, if we look at the situation and the environment in which the organization is operating, it's possible to use this information to focus on our needs assessment. The needs assessment could focus in on things such as the priorities of the target population, barriers to service, what's most appropriate to do, and those kind of things. So again, an in-depth understanding of the situation in the local community helps us to focus our needs assessment. The process evaluation is all about the inputs and the outputs, which includes the activities and the participation. So we can really focus in as part of our process or formative evaluation on evaluating how is the program implemented? Are the activities delivered as we had intended? Are participants being reached as intended? And what are some of the participant reactions? Outcome evaluations focus in on these short-term, medium-term, and long-term outcomes. So we can start asking questions such as to what extent are desired changes occurring? Who's benefiting? What seems to work? What are the unintended consequences? We can be looking in for things such as changes in attitudes, changes in learning on the short-term basis, changes in behaviors, and actions on a medium-term basis, and on the long-term basis, which is sometimes referred to as those broader impacts, we can be focusing in on the social and economic changes. We can also ask to what extent can the changes be attributed to the program, and what are the net effects and final consequences of our program. I just wanted to end by saying thank you for joining me for this two-part session providing an overview of social research. My name is Dr. Robert Barney. Please make sure to check out some of my other videos on YouTube listed under the name Kolani Meshiani. Thanks again.